Hello, everyone, and welcome to the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar on International Conflict. This seminar is co-sponsored by the Weatherhead Center for International Affairs and the Program on Negotiation at Harvard Law School. My name is Donna Hicks, and I chair the seminar, and we are so excited to have our colleague, Rebecca Wolfe, here with us today. You have to understand that Rebecca Wolfe was one of Herbert Kelman's absolute star students, and he was so proud of her, of all the work that she has been doing in order to really support his notion of a scholar practitioner. Because what he believed profoundly was that if we are going to build theory as academics, we have to be on the ground to understand, to gather our data, get our insights and our intuition about how to build that theory. And I can say that Rebecca's work is just superb in that sense. So she is our very beloved scholar practitioner, and as I said, we're just thrilled to have her here to end this semester of the Herbert C. Kelman Seminar. He would be so proud of her. So Rebecca, or let me say before I talk about Rebecca, that we are going to be recording, and we are recording this seminar. So if you want to, in about a week or so, if you want to check in on the PON website, you can take a look at it again, or if you have friends who might have missed it and want to take a look at the talk, please just keep checking in about a week's time, and we'll have it posted there. And I just want to thank you all for coming to this final seminar of the Kelman Seminar, Seminar. And I know we've got people from all over the world as usual, and we're so happy that you're here with us today. And the format of the seminar will be that Rebecca will give her talk for about 40 minutes. And then after that, the last 20 minutes, we'll do a Q&A. And if you would put it in the Q&A function and not in the chat if you have a question, and then I will present the questions to Rebecca. So I think we're good. And I just, as always, want to thank our team here: Billy Fairfield, Diane Long, James Kerwin, Nicole. Nicole. Yes, Nicole, the managing director. And we couldn't have done it all semester as smoothly as we have without this remarkable team. So at the start, I want to say thank you to everyone. And Rebecca's title of her talk today is Bringing Theory to Practice and Practice to Theory, a story of a mediation program in North Central Nigeria. And let me just tell you a little bit about Rebecca. Dr. Rebecca Wolfe is a leading expert on political violence, conflict, and violent extremism. She's a senior lecturer at the Harris School of Public Policy at the University of Chicago, where she's also an associate at the Pearson Institute for the Study of Resolution of Global Conflicts. Prior to joining the faculty at Chicago, she led research and program development related to conflict and fragility at Mercy Corps, an international development and humanitarian agency. Dr. Wolfe draws on her extensive practitioner and academic backgrounds, effectively researching important development issues, designs interventions that are theoretically grounded and evidence-based, and communicates to both to multiple audiences. Over her career, she's developed conflict prevention and violence reduction programs globally, including Kenya's largest youth development program, gang violence prevention in Guatemala City, countering violent extremism in Nigeria and Yemen, and community-based management interventions in Iraq, Syria, Sri Lanka, Indonesia, Tajikistan. Dr. Wolfe has also published research on why young people engage in violence and how to design development interventions to reduce it. She is a fellow, was a fellow at Yale University's Political Violence Field Lab, and currently an affiliate at NYU's Steinhardt School. She has taught at Princeton School of Public and International Affairs and at the Wagner School for Public Service at New York University. She received her PhD in social psychology with Herbert Kelman here at Harvard University. So, Rebecca, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Muted. Thank you, Donna and James. And I also want to thank PON and the Weatherhead Center for inviting me today. It is an incredible honor to be able to do this today. I'm already tearing up. I thought I would get through one slide, but I'm deeply touched to be able to close this semester's Herbert Kelman Seminar. And so I'm going to share my screen now. For some reason, I always have to say it out loud. Okay. So yeah, today, the research I'm going to talk about today, I had actually hoped to share with Herb. We just finished this data collection fairly recently and wrote it up. In my, I would share a lot of the pieces that I would write, the research that I would do in Afghanistan, or some of the writing I did in foreign policy with Herb. And I would call him up, or when I would visit with him, he would tear up multiple times, telling me how proud he was because I had, become the scholar practitioner that I came to grad school for, that I did exactly what I had planned to do. And he was so proud of that. And so today's talk is really dedicated to Herb, who taught me to do the work that you're going to see today. The work is done in collaboration. So while I'm now at University of Chicago, I still work a lot with Mercy Corps. And as Donna said, it's an international development and humanitarian agency that works in about 40 countries around the world. Emmanuel Agabudu, he is our manager on the ground. And he works for Mercy Corps. This work is also with Caitlin Reardon, a PhD student at Berkeley. One thing I want to say, as it's also the PON is a co-sponsor of this work is also deeply influenced by Roger Fisher, who founded PON, and he also founded a group called Conflict Management Group that actually merged with Mercy Corps in 2004. And part of the vision of that merger, and I'll show a photo of that merger of me training in Afghanistan. This was me training government leaders in Afghanistan in 2007, I think. Part of Roger's vision of that merger was to train people in conflict resolution and negotiation and mediation skills all around the world. And part of why I was hired by Mercy Corps was help to actually realize that vision. I started mostly doing training like this. This one was done with Rob Resigliano, also a former PON and CMG alum, but also I moved into doing it as program design. And then, as you'll see today, researching this. And so the study today that I'll talk about really is kind of a validation of how important it is to train people in these skills all around the world. The other person I do need to briefly mention as kind of the big influence on the work I'm going to talk about today is Paul Farmer, who was also a Harvard scholar practitioner who unfortunately died recently. I worked with Paul early in my career at Harvard in 95 and 97. Herb always would comment about how that time with Paul had me focus on issues of development and power imbalances. And how that played out on the negotiation table. And it's Paul who really taught me what it meant to do good development, how evidence could shape policy. And so part of the reason I did a lot of this research at Mercy Corps was we knew programs were an important part of learning, so we could scale them up through policy. And then how lucky we are to do the kind of this work we love. And so I want to both Roger and Paul, in addition to Herb, really influenced the work today. But with that, I'm going to turn to Sri Lanka. And so this is actually where I started doing most of my work and developing of programs at Mercy Corps. And I was asked to go to Sri Lanka. This was in 2008. And so the war was still raging on. It was in the last years of the war, but it was before the worst of the war. But it was still quite active, particularly in the East and North. And I was asked to design a peace building program in the East. And while, you know, this peace building program wasn't going to deal with the macro processes that were really part of, you know, that had to be solved, but it was about the fact that at the communal level, what would happen is there would be an interpersonal incident. So say a car accident between a Tamil Muslim and a Sinhalese Buddhist. And that would actually take on other meaning because they were coming from different sides of the conflict. And so the idea was in those days, and it was, you know, in those moments, it was mostly a conflict between the Tamil Hindus and the Sinhalese Buddhists, was that if we could prevent those kind of incidents to taking on that intergroup escalation, and not allow the rumors to fester and people to mobilize for further violence, we could stop a lot of the pain that was happening in the East in those days. And so the idea was to kind of design a program to mitigate the violence at the communal level. And I brought in a number of social science theories in designing that first program. I remember actually traveling in Batikola, just north, like in the north central northeastern part of the country, and just thinking like how cool it was that I was able to kind of bring theory, like all this stuff I had been studying for many years, to practice. And, you know, there was three main parts of the program. One, there was bringing, you know, teaching religious leaders in the East about negotiation and mediation, and bringing Roger's theories about how to do interest-based negotiation. We also brought in contact theories and superordinate goals. So kind of really traditional, but his, you know, powerful social psych theories about if we brought people together around issues that they both cared about and try to give them opportunities to work on them together and provide some financial incentives to have them be able to actually address these problems, they would begin to cooperate and change their perceptions of one another. Part of that process was also dialogues. And I think this is where Herb's influence really came about in terms of the theory of these programs. And the idea was, you know, if they could build kind of multicultural or multi-religious or multi-ethnic associations, they would start to build, you know, create a new identity. And so Herb's theory of social influence, and particularly around identification. And so if parties could instead build these cross identity coalitions, they would actually be able to, in a sense, create a new identity across these groups. They would actually be able more likely to reconcile. And so that was a big aspect of these programs. And so I designed this program. I was successful in winning the money for the program. And will say I designed similar programs, and I can talk about how I contextualize them for different countries and different areas of countries across the world. So whether it was in Kenya, in Yemen, Tajikistan, a number of the places that Donna mentioned earlier, we designed similar programs, you know, where we were trying to kind of mitigate violence through mediation, but also kind of build those relationships and change how the identity, or change how people thought about identity, not changing identity, but how people were thinking or conceiving of their identities in these programs. And I'll say, again, it was a fascinating time of my life, and I loved doing it, but I always had this question. I'm like, does it work? And how could we better understand if it worked? And so then in 2000, around, I was thinking about 2014, we had designed one of these programs around farmer herder violence in north central Nigeria. And and I had approached the program manager, who also has affiliation with PON. She was a Fletcher grad and had participated a lot in the negotiation world when she was a grad student here. And I approached her and I said, could we do a randomized controlled trial on this program that we had just won? And there was a hesitation, and in the Q&A, I can talk a bit more about the ethics of randomization in these type of settings. But the idea was, a lot of people question randomization in areas of conflict. But here, the question was, given or evaluating even peace building programs in a lot of these places, in a lot of contexts, because there's so much going on. So how can you actually attribute your program to kind of these larger outcomes? And I feel like it's actually, we want to know that despite all of these things that are out of individuals' control that are happening, can these programs actually help these people despite all these other things going around? And so this is sort of what we learned in this first evaluation that we did. And it was on a program that was very similar to the ones I described. We trained leaders in mediation, and we also did kind of this dialogue and kind of contact where people worked on joint problems. And we had quite strong results in that first study. This was actually done with Chris Grady and Danjuma Dewap and Lisa Inks. And what we learned was that actually, so right before we did the final data collection, we had, there was a law in Benue State where they restricted grazing of the herders. So this is, and I should have said this earlier, most of the conflict in this part of Nigeria that I'll be talking about today is farmer herder violence. And so the state had put out this law that caused or sparked a lot of violence and a lot of displacement in this area of Nigeria. And what we saw that despite all of, all the violence that was out of these communities' control in the places we worked, people still maintained contact. One of our best measures in that study was we actually had people observing what was going on in the markets. And in the places where we were working, herders still kept on coming to the markets, which were most often in farmer communities. In places we weren't working, the herders stopped coming. And so it was, it showed in a sense like these type of programs created a resilience for these communities to actually withstand these shocks that could happen from the outside. However, what we couldn't actually see was the mediation working. So this was kind of, as I said, it was a bundled program. It had both mediation and these joint projects. And people in our surveys, they didn't seem to even know that mediation had happened. And it was, I know Anjuma, my colleague from Nigeria, who was very passionate about the mediation training. And he was like, I know, that all these disputes were resolved. We have this data that shows that disputes were resolved and things were happening. And it made me question, was maybe actually it's because the mediation was so successful that people didn't know it happened. People were feeling more secure in those communities, but maybe it's that because the mediation was so successful, people didn't know there was something in the rest of the community, that there was something to be worried about because it got settled so fast. I mean, one of the biggest challenges of violence prevention and conflict prevention programming is that if it doesn't happen, how do you know if it didn't happen, how do you actually know that it worked? And so it made, with colleagues, as we were able to win some continued money to do this work in North Central Nigeria, we said, what if we just look at the mediation component and see if if that's having an effect. So when we do it as this bundle, we're not sure what's happening. We think it's having an effect, but also the other type of work is so much more public than the mediation work. The whole community gets to see the results of the joint work between community members. A mediation is in private. And so we felt, let's just look at the mediation part of the program for 1 year and see what effect that has. And so that's the crux of the talk I'm going have today. And so the work, it's again, a USAID funded project, and it's in Benue State that I just mentioned, Kogi next to it, and then Plateau. As I mentioned, it's farmer-herder violence. And so while until recently, most of the focus of at least the media outside of Nigeria was focused on the conflict in Boko Haram, which is in the Northeast. And I have other research related to that I'm also happy to talk about later. But this conflict is between farmers and herders is actually more people have been killed related to that conflict than to the conflict for Boko Haram. And it has gotten worse over probably the last 5 to 8 years. And it's a confluence of issues, of climate issues where herders are having to travel further south from the Sahel in order to find grazing land. And so the herders that are coming down are less aware of certain agreements that have happened between farmer and herder communities. And so that has created more conflict. There's just more people on the land that have to use it. And so that has created more conflict. And then it's an area of, where the government hasn't had as much presence. These are very rural areas of Nigeria. And so there are fewer, the state is considered weak in these areas. Their security doesn't have isn't present. And when they are present, they're often not trusted. And so using community-based structures are often a way to try to reduce the violence in these areas. And so, as I said, so we had this new program, and I worked with the team on the ground to see, for 1 year, could we just focus on the mediation aspect of the program? And we looked at it in 2 ways. And I'm not going to go through every single hypothesis in detail, but we have 2 sets of them. One is with the leaders. And so we worked with leaders, both traditional leaders, with women leaders, with youth leaders. There's a local partner on the ground, PARE. It's a pastoralist Resolve. I've worked with them now for many years, and they really know these communities and help us identify those leaders that already have influence in the community. So we're not trying to create new leaders. We are working with current structures, trying to make them more diverse, as I said, including more women and youth leaders in these training, but working within structures rather than creating new structures. And so we, assume that those leaders that get the training, they'll report having higher skills. The trainings are done jointly between farmer and herders. And so because of the training in of itself, they'll feel more social cohesion between each other. And then, of course, because they're resolving these conflicts, there'll be fewer violent events in these areas. They'll also feel more secure. But I think where I'm most curious is, what does this do for the rest of the community? So does the community actually feel the fact or recognize the fact that things are different? And so we also have a set of hypotheses about how people not even involved in the dispute resolution, but the wider community, do they sense a change in the community due to this training? And so we look at whether they report fewer violent events, do they feel more secure? Are they more satisfied with dispute resolution in their communities? Again, even if they're not going to it, maybe it's something like a norm that they know it's going better. And then does this have effect on how communities feel about one another? One of the challenges in a lot of peace building programs is if there's current violence going on and you're trying to, bring people together, they're in a sense getting opposite signals. Well, I hear about this violence that's happening between, farmers and herders here, and now you're asking me to try to build a relationship with a farmer if I'm a herder or vice versa. And so it's very confusing in essence of how to think about things. And so the hope is that if there are fewer violent events, there'll be more opportunity for that cohesion. So how did we look at this? So as I said, we did it as a randomized controlled trial. So we had 88 communities in total. 44 of them had leaders trained in interest-based negotiation and mediation. And then we had 44 that were considered a pure control where there was no training. And we did leader surveys. And so there are about, I think, and I should have written this number down, I never remember it, about 300 leaders trained in the 44 communities. So there are about 600 leader surveys. And then we also surveyed over 4,000 people across the 3 states in those targeted communities, both the ones that got the training and those that didn't. And so just to give you an idea of the sample, as I said, we are trying to diversify it. Leadership is still quite male in this area of Nigeria. So the sample of leaders is 26% female. Again, because they're leaders, they tend to be older. So the average age is 45. The broader sample, community sample is a bit more diverse. It's 44% female. On the religion, it's 70% Christian. So largely in this area of Nigeria, farmers tend to be Christian. Herders tend to be Muslim. Outsiders like to frame it as a religious conflict. I have tried not to use that framing because the people on the ground don't view it as a religious conflict. It is really a resource-based conflict. But also part of the reason our sample is heavily Christian is that that displacement I talked about earlier in Benue state, that displacement has continued. So Benue tends to be more Christian than it was, say, back in 2018. We have, the major ethnic groups represented. I should say the herders are largely Fulani, and then the farmers are largely Tib and Agala. As I mentioned, is a largely rural population with 90% rural. Most are doing farming. Only 11% say their primary livelihood is being a herder. That is that most herders don't do multiple things in order for their livelihoods today, and many are what we would consider semi-nomadic. Okay, I realize I'm already going over. Don't have much time left, so I'm going to go through this a couple slides relatively quickly. But first is, as I said, we had different types of leaders trained in mediation. What type of things did they resolve? And so our traditional elders, mostly did land disputes or farmer herder, as we would expect. Versus religious leaders and women leaders tended to more do family and domestic disputes is what they resolved. And then youth leaders also worked on farmer herder issues and civil society. And so there is some type of kind of sorting that happens of what types of issues that people go to which leaders for. With our leaders, you know, basically all the hypotheses were confirmed. So they had more confidence in their skills. They 89% of them said they resolved half their disputes versus 77% of the ones who didn't get the training. They really improved their perception of out-group leaders. So basically, you know, if I was a herder, I would more likely expect that a farmer leader would hold up his end of a bargain. They're more likely to socialize with people from the other groups, and they did report lower levels of violence. One of the concerns, particularly I have you know, of the violence one is that, you know, these are the people that had training. While there's certain evidence that, you know, people actually report in surveys more honestly than we actually thought, there could be kind of, you know, some self-presentation effects. I've got this mediation training. I want to report. Maybe I'm not going to see, in a sense, even see the violence that I would have seen without it, because I'm in this kind of mindset. So as I said, you know, my real curiosity was, does this matter for the wider community? And, you know, we saw big effects. And so, you know, community members were asked, did you experience any violent conflict in the last 6 months? And the gray line are the control communities, and the blue is the intervention. And what we find is that, you know, only 30% of the intervention communities, you know, experience violence in the last 6 months, while, you know, half in the control did. And I should say, this is statistically significant. We also see they're more likely to feel safe. And so we ask them, do you feel unsafe walking around the area where you live? And the control, you know, again, over half are feeling unsafe versus it's only a third in the intervention communities. They are, you know, less likely to avoid going into conflict groups area. As I said, or, you know, for example, markets tend, you know, if you're a herder, most likely the market is going to be in a farmer community. And so actually avoiding those areas has a huge ramifications for, you know, livelihoods. And so you can imagine also for schools, health, and so forth, given that these, you know, there's only so many services in these areas. And so being more likely to go into travel is really important for a whole host of outcomes. And so we see that it actually reduces or improves their willingness to go to a conflicting area. And we also see that in these, people felt more that disputes were resolved more satisfactorily. What we didn't find, however, is that it changed social cohesion. So we do see some evidence that there is interaction between, like, particularly again around trade and economic interaction. We do see more of that between groups, but we don't see that it changed trust. This was different than the previous study I mentioned, that kind of bundled study where they did both mediation and the contact. We did actually see changes in trust, but in this one we didn't. And so what we're doing, and in some ways it makes sense. So this is, you know, the mediation and somewhat is a top-down type of intervention. It's about stopping the violence. Versus kind of the dialogues and the contact work is about building relationships. And so, you know, the fact that we, especially, and I should have said this earlier, the training was done about a year before the data collection, the end-line data collection. And so relationships take longer to change. It's, one thing to stop violence, but to actually know that you trust someone is going to take a lot more time. And so now we're actually doing follow-up work, which I'll talk about in a moment. And so there's two kind of sets of recommendations. We frame this talk as, this about a scholar practitioner. So of course, from this research, I have both kind of policy prescriptions or practice prescriptions, but also kind of thinking about research. And so from this work, what are the lessons and recommendations for practice? I mean, one of the big pieces, and a colleague, when he saw the evaluation, he was like, he had somewhat poo-pooed this type of training of leaders. It was such a basic type of intervention in peace building for so long that he didn't even know if it really had an effect. We didn't know if it had effect. He was skeptical it did after all these years. And we see, particularly again, in areas where the state isn't present, where you have local leaders who have influence, investing in improving their capabilities is quite effective. It's also what we would say is cost effective in these areas. The training for leaders wasn't particularly expensive. If you think about having to police those areas, what the most government policy in Nigeria, and actually it's spreading elsewhere in up in the Sahel, is to, in a sense, prevent grazing. And that has to be policed in order to prevent it. And so if you act, and that's very costly. And so this is a way of managing relationships between farmers and herders in a way that, one, reduces violence, but also is much less costly. In terms of practice, I think we haven't thought very clearly about which interventions affect which outcomes. And as I said, I think one, we tried to do kind of bundled programming and throw a lot at it because, we're new in the kind of more empirical learning about the and evaluation of peace building programs. And so, I think what mediation does that's really important is to stop violence. You can't do much if violence is happening, but you can, but how do we pair that with interventions that are going to build that trust between groups that, in a sense, are hopefully create more sustainable change over time? In a sense, the mediation is the Band-Aid. If we think like humanitarian programming and development programming, humanitarian is that Band-Aid, but we have to deal with the underlying issues. And so I see mediation as a sense that Band-Aid, that's a really important Band-Aid because you, again, can't stop the bleeding without it. But then that provides space for kind of that longer range programming that is going to create that longer term change. And that goes to, again, and this is a very kind of practical design part of peace building programming, is how do you sequence and phase these pieces? And so what I often see is that programs try to do everything at once. And as I mentioned earlier, the problem of trying to do everything at once is that if you haven't stopped the violence, people are getting these different signals, violence is still happening and you're asking me to trust. And how do I make sense of that? And so by maybe sequencing it with first stopping the violence and then doing the longer term programming might actually be more successful and not take as long when you have stopped these kind of contradictory messages that people are getting. And then I'll end on kind of the next steps for research. So I mentioned we're continuing this work in an adaptive way. And so we have this, finding where the program isn't doing much on social cohesion. What we've layered onto the program now is dialogues. And so, and trying to see, are mediation training and dialogues, are they complements to one another? Do they support each other? Do they work on these different things as we hypothesize? Or are they substitutes of one another. And so in half the communities, so in half of the treatment communities and half of the control communities, they will have dialogues. And so we'll in a sense have, 4 cells where we can look at, mediation alone, dialogues alone, the two together, and that compare that to nothing. And so we have been implementing that now, and maybe in about a year and a half, I can come back to the Kelman seminar and talk to you about those results. Because and so we should have them about then. But I think for me, this research and going back to Herb's writing is about connecting micro and macro processes for conflict resolution and peace building. One, as I mentioned earlier, it is, the fact in that earlier research, we had kind of this mobilization of violence that didn't hit the communities we were working in a sense, protected them. And it's always made me think about, people question, what's the good of these kind of community level type of peace building programs when there are these macro processes going on. We've been fortunate in Nigeria that elites haven't mobilized these divisions that like we've seen elsewhere. Bosnia is a great example or an awful example of how when this happens. South Sudan is another place that's current where these intercommunal divides are mobilized for greater violence. And so, and I think, this community type of intervention is really important for probably preventing that type of escalation. But we actually need to do more research on understanding how kind of these micro and macro processes, or particularly in bottom up and top down processes, fit together. And how they influence each other, and how this can inform theory about how to work on them at different types of levels. And so it's, bringing it back to Herb, is that what we really do learn at the micro can actually have influence on the macro. And with that, I will open it up for questions.
Okay.
Let's stop. Should I stop my share? Sorry.
Yeah, stop your share. I'm trying to get there I am. Okay. Yeah. Wow, Rebecca, Herb would be proud. It's amazing how you were able to craft all those critical hypotheses and, give us all answers. And I just think it's wonderful research. Thank you for doing all that. It'll help all of us out there in the field. So thank you. And we do have some questions. We probably won't get to them all, but the first question I have here is in peace building mediation, what external and internal factors are taken into account?
So I'm not sure I'm trying to, as I said, I think what we're focused on here is, the community level. And so I'll take the community level as the internal, and that's how I hope it's how you meant the question. Whoever asked, I apologize if I misinterpreted it.
No, I think that's probably it,
yeah.
Rebecca.
And we actually try not to take in the external. And I mean, again, and there are some concerns with that. So for example, there are some power imbalances between the farmers and herders. The media in Nigeria is pretty tends to be anti-herder. And so actually one of the, in some of our responses, we do worry how that might influence how people are seeing things. Particularly, I didn't talk about some of how we disaggregated the data, but we do find that farmers tend to be more negative and report more violence than herders. But we suspect part of that is due to media influence, since they're in the same communities. So,
Right.
And so we use it more in terms of interpretation, but the mediators themselves are working on very local disputes and not on those. And so as I said, it could be, often it is something like a land incursion. So a cow actually, often by accident, stamped out a farmer's plants. And so there has to be some discussion about it. And often those are the type of things that would really escalate into violence before we were in these communities. And so that's what we're talking about. As I said, some of it is family disputes. And that is within community. I should also say there is not as much herder conflict, but there actually is quite a bit of farmer violence and conflict in these areas. And so it's also some of the mediation is within group.
Okay. The next question is, first of all, thank you very much, Dr. Wolfe, for sharing with us your experience and thoughts. My question is in two parts, namely, did you have and could you probably kindly share with us any example or situations when exactly the model ways of thinking of one's identity in the same group could influence the likelihood and severity of violations within the group? If so, what are these models and ways, and how can one cultivate those that can definitely reduce tensions within the same group or between groups? Thank you very much, she says.
Oh, big question, and a fascinating question. I mean, it actually reminds me more of my work in the Northeast than it does with this work. I will say one piece of this work and the dialogue work that I would love to do one day is, we talk about, and even the interactive problem solving workshop did this, where, meeting with each group separately before bringing groups together. And that is to really think of, build trust between the mediators or the facilitators and the group, kind of get out some of that anxiety and so forth about meeting across groups. I do have questions about whether that could actually solidify identities. We know about polarization and so forth. And I think it's an empirical question that needs to be investigated. So, because I know a lot of groups, Mercy Corps and others that do dialogue work have that similar model of not waiting, having first within group dialogue before cross-group dialogue. And I'm sure there are conditions under which that's appropriate, and I suspect there might be conditions where it could lead to polarization and make it actually harder to have those conversations. So that is like a to-be research project. But I would say, this was a question I actually thought a lot about. So my work in Northeast Nigeria is actually about community acceptance of former members of Boko Haram and how to increase, for reconciliation to happen, community members are going to have to allow people to come back who did all, and often forced to do, but did awful things. And so one of the questions we tried to get at, and it was very hard to, was, these were members of those communities that committed these horrible acts. I mean, one place I went, a group of women that I talked with, every single woman said they had a child kidnapped by Boko Haram. And, and for these mothers, it was, how can I not let my sons and daughters come home? And yet they hurt the group by, we're now stigmatized as Kunari in Northeast Nigeria as being members of Boko Haram, and they hurt our whole reputation. And so that is something where I can see identity, people really grappling with, and how to deal with members who violate those norms.
Yeah, that's a tough one. So here is an interesting question, simple, but an interesting question. How did you select who would be trained and who would not?
So the training that was done by the local partner. this group called PARE. And they've been working in these areas of Nigeria. So I had started working with them, I think in 2012 or 2013. And I think they had been there 5 to 10 years earlier than that. And so they, know these communities really well. And so they knew who kind of the traditional leaders were. They also would talk to people and kind of do network to figure out, particularly, as I said, we wanted to broaden with women and youth. And I should say youth in these areas are considered 30 and under. And so a youth probably was more likely about 25, not a teenager. And so it was really through that local knowledge that we were able to identify, both for the community. So, I probably skipped over this, but, we did have leaders in the control communities that we identified who will get trained later. But they've been part of this surveying as well. And so we had to select similar leaders in both places.
Okay. So let's see. Is it ethical to do a randomized trial? I know you mentioned that you could address this in the Q&A. It's not the aim to reduce violence isn't the aim to reduce violence as largely as possible. It could have been a single arm trial with all trained and use the real world historical data as a synthetic control arm. Thank you for your views.
So I'll say the first part of it is there's, a lot of programming. There is not a lot of money, and there's not enough money to train leaders everywhere. So actually, based on the initial budget, we actually are training many more leaders than we initially thought we would. We actually found a way to reallocate things. So initially they were only supposed to hit 25 communities, and we're almost doubling the number of communities. It was actually part of it was a mistake that happened in the field. And so we had to figure out how to do it differently, and reduce our budget to get in more communities. But again, there's, unfortunately, there are limited resources. And so the question is, are you going to, if you have to have some people get it and some people not, do it in a way that fosters the most learning? And so that's kind of, and randomization allows us to better causally attribute the change to the program. So for example, if I had just done a one-arm trial in that first study I talked about very briefly, where there was that blip of violence, what really happened is, things in the places we were in stayed the same, and the places we were in, things went down. If we hadn't had the counterfactual, we would have thought our program just did nothing. But because we actually had the counterfactual, we were able to see that it, in a sense, built this resilience. If we, of course, had money for everywhere, it would be wonderful, but we don't. On using synthetic or historical data, as much as, even for the current study, I would love to say use ACLA data to be getting more objective measures of violence. Unfortunately, at a community level, it's just not geolocated enough to get at that fine grained. And so we're not able to do that type of analysis in these areas yet.
Okay, Rebecca, thank you. Let's see, we probably have time for a couple more. So sampling is very skewed to farmers, this person is asking.
Yes. As I said, part of that is in Benue State. It used to be more 50-50 in Benue, and then there was this big displacement that happened in 2018. About 2018. And so unfortunately, most of those herders have moved to Nasarawa State. And so that is unfortunate. And the funding is for Benway State. It's something we've, are beginning to talk to the donor about, is how do we deal with the fact that a lot of the violence is across the Nasarawa Benway State border. So that, as I said, it skews the sample. Some of the violence, I didn't get deep into the contextual issues in this area. And I apologize if I skipped over it too much. Never know how deep to go. A lot of, it's easier to talk about it in terms of farmer herder violence. And that was the initial reason we started doing this work there. Farmer violence is actually increasing also in these areas. As I said, the pressures on land are growing. And so between population, between climate change, so less arable land. And so that is causing more problems between even farmer communities.
Yeah, I mean, climate change, we'll need another seminar for that topic. Okay, this is probably will be the last one. I appreciate your proper characterization of the conflicts encountered to be resource-based instead of religious. What is your view then about the impact of mischaracterization of conflicts on such rural communities, especially where specialist assistance is not available to manage or resolve these disputes?
One of the topics I always said I wanted to write more about, actually, I really worry about that in this area. The Fulani have been mischaracterized as as an extremist group, a terrorist group. And I worry what that would mean for peace building programming, because as soon as they're designated a terrorist group, and they're not an organized group, it's not an organized group. We couldn't do this peace building programming with them because of regulations. And I can't tell you how often I am told about the risk of Boko Haram coming to this area of Nigeria, or other violent extremist groups coming to this area of Nigeria and recruiting. And I'm like, they haven't yet. It's not, there are reasons that hasn't happened. But there is a definite, I think in Myanmar, this has always been a big concern, is that when people try to particularly put a religious frame on what is not religious-based conflicts, particularly if they're Muslim-based, there is this risk of being if the group has ties to Islam, there are huge risks of it becoming part of the kind of counterterrorism narrative that is very damaging to those conflicts.
Well, Rebecca, you certainly didn't disappoint, and I'm sure Herb is up there doing a little dance and congratulating you. So thank you so much, and we're going to take you up on the offer that you made, that when you get the new data, the new findings ready for publication or ready to talk about, we're going to have you. So just keep that in mind. We'd love to have you come back. Yes, thank you. And I'd also like to thank everyone who came to hear Rebecca's wonderful presentation. And I'm now going to turn it over to James, who just wants to say a couple of words about some upcoming PON events. So thank you, Rebecca.
Yes, and thank you, Donna. And Rebecca, thank you so much for sharing your work with us. And we wish you continued success in your research. And I want to echo what Donna said. we're going to take you up on that offer in a year and a half to have you come back. We'd love to hear what your findings are. And to the audience, thank you so much for joining us. This is the last Kelman seminar this academic year. PON has other events that are going on. We do a number of executive education trainings that we invite you to join us. Also, we do some semester-length courses that will be starting up again in September, along with the Kelman seminars in September. And also in the summer, we will have a few PON live events. So keep monitoring your inbox. We want to keep the learning going in the summertime. And next week here in Cambridge is an exciting time as Harvard University celebrates commencement exercises, and we're in person. So we're really thrilled about that. And we're so happy that we have this virtual community that we've built over these few years. And we thank you for joining us today and always. Have a wonderful weekend.